Now let's come to supply curves. What underlies supply curves? Now on the one hand, this will be much easier than demand curves because a lot of the logic is the same. So we can march more quickly through the analysis because it's basically the same kind of tangency of curves with straight lines that yield supply curves that we've seen with consumer theory. On the other hand, supply curves are a ton harder because now we don't just have a price as given to consumers. Okay? These suppliers actually make up the price. With consumers, we said the price, you just went to the store, you're given a price, and you choose what to buy based on those prices. Well, who sets those prices? Producers do. And that's what determines the underlying supply curve. So life gets a little bit more difficult with producers. And that's why I'll probably spend about twice as many lectures talking about producer theory as we spent talking about consumer theory. Okay. Now, let's go to the basics. The basics are, just as we had consumers making decisions, we thought of a consumer as somebody choosing across a bundle of goods, pizza versus movies. Now we're going to think of a producer very simply as a black box where inputs go in and outputs come out. So think of the firm, let's think of a firm or producer as just some black box where literally think of a flow chart. You've got inputs that go in and outputs that come out. Okay? And that black box, that firm, just as individuals have a simple goal, which is to maximize their utility. Producers have a simple goal, which is to maximize their profits. And profits are defined as revenue minus costs. Okay? Producers are these black boxes where their goal is to maximize their profits, which is revenue minus costs. And the key to maximizing profits is efficient production. The key to maximizing profits is going to be to produce goods as efficiently as possible. Okay? So profit maximization requires production efficiency. To maximize your profits, you need to produce as efficiently as possible. To decide how to efficiently produce goods, we're going to turn and today discuss firm production functions. Production functions. Okay, today we'll focus on production functions. That's essentially the technology by which a firm takes inputs, or what we call factors of production, and turns them into outputs, is through this production function. So just like your utility function is a tool through which we take bundles of goods and turn them into happiness, a production function is a tool through which we take bundles of inputs and turn them into outputs. Okay? But in some sense, it's a little easier to understand this. You can think of a factory where stuff comes in and, think of a belt, a mechanical belt going through and stuff comes in and other stuff comes out. You can think of that production function. Okay. We're going to think about two different kinds of inputs that firms are going to use. Once again, to make life easy, we're going to assume firms only use two kinds of inputs. Later we'll expand this, but most of the intuition you can get from thinking about this. Two kinds of inputs. Labor and capital. Labor and capital are the two kinds of inputs firms use. Okay? Labor is clear. It's just hours of labor, hours of work. Okay? It's just hours of work in production. Capital is a lot trickier, and we'll spend a lot of time this semester struggling with what capital really means. Okay? Basically, for now, think of capital as everything else that goes in production. The machines, the buildings, the land, everything. Okay? Think of capital as everything else that goes into production. So basically, when you produce stuff, you produce it with workers working with stuff. Capital's the stuff. Okay? Now, it's so think of capital as sort of a composite of everything else that goes into production. And once again, we'll add some more detail on this later. Okay? And the output is some output Q. That's the units of production. That's the output that's produced by the firm. Okay? So basically, we can think of a production function is Q is some function of L and K. That's a production function. That the output you produce as your firm, And by the way, we're going to use little q to represent a firm's output and big Q to represent market output. Okay? So little q, and I may, if I slip in this, yell at me. Okay? But we're going to try to consistently use little q to represent a given firm's output and big Q to be the market's output. Okay? So little q is some function of the amount of workers you have and the amount of capital you use. Now, the important distinction we're going to make here is between variable versus fixed inputs. Variable versus fixed inputs is an important distinction we're going to draw. Okay. Variable inputs are inputs that are easily changed, like how many hours somebody works. In principle, you could just have someone work 5 hours one day, 1 hour the next day, 10 hours the day after that. It's easy to change hours of work. So that's a variable input. Fixed inputs are things which are harder to change quickly, like the size of the building that the workers are building in. Okay? Once that building's built, it's pretty hard to change it. You can't like lop off 2/3 of it one day and add it back the next day. Okay? That's more of a fixed input. And this will lead to a critical distinction for production theory, which is the short run versus the long run. The short run versus the long run. The long run is the period over which all inputs are variable. The short run is a period over which some inputs are fixed. Let me say it again, it's very important. The short run is the period over which some inputs are fixed. The long run is the period over which all inputs are variable. Okay? Now, what does that mean? I can't tell you. Okay? I can tell you that clearly tomorrow is the short run. Clearly you can't vary all your inputs over one day. And probably next month is the short run, and probably even next year is the short run. There's a lot of inputs that it takes more than a month to change, a year to change. On the other hand, 10 years from now is almost certainly the long run. There's very few inputs to production you can't change over a 10-year period. So we know a day is a short run, we know 10 years is the long run, we don't really know where the transition is, but in some sense that doesn't matter for you guys. What matters is the definition of short run, long run. If someone asks you what the long run is, you say it's the period over time over which all inputs are variable. That's what matters. So it doesn't matter if you define it in days or months or years. What we know is it's a theoretical concept, which is the break between the short run and the long run is the break between when some inputs are fixed and all inputs are variable. Okay? Now, of course, once again, this is tricky, and economists recognize this subtlety. A lot of times economists will talk about quasi-fixed factors of production, which are things which are, you know, kind of you can change in between the short run and the long run. So for instance, take labor. Okay? We'll talk about labor as a variable unit of production that you can change in the short run. But in fact, we know in practice you can't. Most jobs, you can't ask the guys to come for an hour one day and 10 hours the next day and 5 hours the day after that. Maybe some jobs like hourly construction. But most jobs you guys will have, okay, your labor isn't that variable. We're typically on some kind of reasonably set work schedule. Now that work schedule can evolve, okay, but it can't change day by day. None of us are going to have jobs where they're going to say, look, work 2 hours today and 12 hours the next day, etc. Okay? We're all going to have jobs with a fairly smooth distribution. There'll be peaks and valleys, but a fairly smooth distribution of our labor effort. So really, truly, there's very few inputs which are truly perfectly variable. Okay? Just like there are no inputs which are truly perfectly fixed. But for the purposes of this model, let's think about labor as a variable input. Let's think about labor as being like hourly construction. Okay? And let's think about capital as being a fixed input, like a building, that you can't tear down and rebuild overnight, but over a 10-year period you can.